Welcome to another episode of Off the Record podcast. This episode is our last episode for the 2025 season. Today we are joined by Natercia Dos Santos Niz, who is a senior associate in the environmental law department. Natercia's practice covers the length and breadth of environmental law, from water compliance to legal compliance, and also conducting audits across the country. Natercia has also assisted clients from Match Court, High Court, Supreme Court of Appeal, and the Constitutional Court across environmental compliance matters. In her spare time, she's also an avid member of the running community. Tersh, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Natercia is going to be taking us through the topic of health and safety. So to kick us off, I'd like for you to explain, as an environmental lawyer, how do you interact with health and safety?
So the main area we see health and safety coming up in is our auditing. And as you said, we audit across the country, and we don't really like considering health and safety and environmental as two separate silos. We think that from a compliance perspective, it's always best to consider them as sort of one ecosystem.
Okay. So what exactly do you do on these audits?
Whenever we arrive, we see the company, they've got all of their licenses out, they've got all of their legislative requirements out, and everyone's always a little bit nervous when we arrive because we're very thorough. But the whole purpose of the audit is to ensure that the compliance culture at the business is where it should be in terms of the legislated standards.
Okay. So when we talk about the umbrella term of health and safety, what do you, as an attorney who's conducting the audit, look for?
So when we conduct our health and safety, and I'm just going to include environmental under the umbrella because it's the same concept. When we go to site, we do a physical site visit. So we would walk around, and then we also conduct an audit of the licenses that the company has. If, for example, the company needs to be in compliance with norms and standards that are regulated under a specific piece of legislation, for example, the Waste Act, then we would also look at the norms and standards, and we would then compare what the company is doing at the specific facility and see how it measures up to the standards that they are required to comply with.
So norms and standards, if I'm correct, is almost the checklist of what the employer has to do. And then you come in and then you make sure that the employer is doing what they're supposed to do in terms of the act.
Exactly.
So then how do you deal with situations when an employer is not following that checklist?
So what we do is we separate our compliance into 3 different levels when we put a report together. So we have obviously compliance, which is what everybody wants. Then we have non-compliance, and then we have an observation. And then our non-compliance is separated into 2 further categories, which are minor non-compliances, which are sort of orange flags, and then we have our major non-compliances, which are red flags. Exactly. And then our observations are, if we were to look at how industry is conducting itself in general, how is the specific company measuring up, and are there any measures that they can put in place to better their operations? And then we'll also highlight those as observations within the report itself.
Okay. And how far does your report go? So do you also get involved in the process of, you've identified the orange flags and the red flags, and now you're telling the employer this is how you fix it, or do you just leave it at report stage?
So we try to do everything we can to help hold the company's hand and ensure that their compliance is not just a tick box exercise.
Okay.
So we would say, okay, we've identified that you're struggling with, I've referenced waste already, so I'll just continue with that. You're struggling with waste management specifically. And these are the things that we've seen done at other companies that we suggest you could implement here, or we'll say that the legislative standard is X. Currently, you're sitting on Y, but you need to be on X. This is how you close that gap between where you are at the moment and where you're meant to be in terms of the legislated standard, or in terms of whatever your license requirements are.
Yeah. And what triggers you going to the employer to conduct an audit? Are you receiving a report from a whistleblower? Or is there a certain, time period that employers have to follow as to when they have these audits done?
So the audits are generally regulated by license requirements, or like we referenced earlier, the norms and standards. So in terms of, for example, the norms and standards for the storage of waste, an internal audit is required. But then we also look at license requirements. So majority of licenses will have internal and external auditing requirements. So an employer will call us in and say, we need help with our internal audit, or we need help with our external audit, and then we'll go in as a result of that request.
Okay. And have you ever dealt with instances of whistleblowers? So let's say I'm suspecting a company is not disposing of its waste correctly, or they impacting the environment in a negative way. Where do you come in with those kinds of situations?
So generally, we act more for industry. So
Okay.
we don't, obviously because of the conflict of interest, we don't generally have whistleblowers coming to us directly, because we often are already acting for that specific company. But in general, we would obviously expect that whistleblowers would be protected, because they're obviously entitled to have the environment that they are working in. They're entitled to that environment to be safe and in compliance with what the legislative requirements are in terms of occupational health and safety and environmental law.
Okay. And with these audits, is there a certain time period that they have to take in terms of the norms and standards? So do you have to be on site for a specific period of time? Do you need to engage with specific people? Is that included in the norms and standards?
So it depends on the norms and standards that you're looking at, or it will depend on the specific license requirements. But generally what we do is when we go onto site, we will go and we will interview employees, and we will try to ensure that if, for example, if there's training that's meant to be done in terms of the license or in terms of the norms and standards, then we'll ask for proof of that training, and then we will chat with the employees and find out, the training was done, but was the training done effectively enough for the employees to actually gain an understanding of what the requirements of that specific license or of what that specific piece of legislation requires.
Okay. So as an employer, let's say I've now listened to your expertise. I'm not quite sure what to do. I don't know if an audit has been done, if it's been done recently. What is the next step that I should be taking?
I would say the next step you should be taking, if you're unsure, is to get an attorney to double check for you as soon as possible. And I just say that because, we speak about compliance and how important compliance is. The reason we speak about how important compliance is because non-compliance for employers is a huge, huge risk. And when we look at health and safety non-compliance, when we look at environmental non-compliance, the risks are on two levels. We have a risk for employees. We have a risk for people who are residing within the immediate vicinity of the site. But then on another serious level, we have, our legislation accounts for it. Directors can be held criminally liable where there is harm to the environment that they haven't remedied. So I would say that if you're unsure of whether or not you comply, or if there is a need for you to comply, that you get to an attorney and you find out as soon as possible if your operations fall within the compliance requirements.
Okay, so I think all in all, I want to make sure that I'm capturing you correctly, because it's quite a lot of important information you've shared. Employers need to make sure that they comply. And if they're not sure if they are compliant, they reach out to Natercia so that they can guide them and make sure that they do comply and not held criminally liable.
Yes, I think that would be it in a nutshell.
Okay. Thank you so much for joining us on today's episode of Off the Record, our last episode of the 2025 season. Natercia, thank you so much for your time. Please do join us for the 2026 season that will be kicking off next year.